Very welcome to this special session today as we launch the Free the Prisoners campaign, Free the Political Prisoners campaign. You are very welcome to be with us. The International Coalition for Human Rights in the Philippines is a baby, was just launched in 2019. Which is just last year, maybe still this year because 2020 hasn't quite started. We all know what has happened to 2020 with the COVID pandemic with us. So 2019, it was launched and we have been involved in a few activities apart from just organizing ourselves and organizing our agenda for campaigning for human rights for the Philippines. We've been involved in this period of time of our existence in the United Nations process and input regarding what came out as the Iceland resolution. But we've also been involved with mining campaigns, with Mining Watch, and also with the Political Prisoners campaign, which we are launching today. And we do have upcoming work. We are launching a series of campaigns to create awareness, to find more comrades who can join the struggle. And we will be launching another campaign to defend the Codrilela and defend the Negros Islands. But for today, we are focusing on freeing the political prisoners. There are, remember, in the Philippines, about 933 prisons, which are housing more than 215,000 detainees. And these are prisons which were built or meant for a population of just 40,610. And today they are housing 215,000. And 619 of them are political prisoners. 2 years ago, I visited 42 of these political prisoners. And some of them were labor organizers, some of them were farmers, some of them were health workers, some of them were students, and some of them were religious leaders, clergy, those that have been arrested and in many cases on trumped-up charges. Let me recognize some organizations that are present with us here today. We do have the National Union of Public and General Employees. Welcome, a big shout out to them. Welcome and good to see you on this platform. We do have the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Salama po, good to see you here. We do have the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. We recognize you. Good to see you, those of you that have joined. We have the Alberta Union of Public Employees. You are also welcome, welcome. We have the National Canadian Union of Public Employees. You are very welcome. And we have the United Food and Commercial Workers Union. You are very, very welcome. We also have other unions of Alberta Health Services. We recognize you. We do have colleagues or people from the United Church of Canada. Welcome. People from Kairos, Canada. Welcome. The Beaconsfield Initiative. Welcome. And to all our speakers who've agreed graciously to be with us today, we welcome you to this platform of launching the Free Political Prisoners campaign. And we do have our first speaker with us. Oh, my friend Jigs. We were together last year. And good to see you that you found time to be with us here and to bring to us the knowledge and the expertise that you've acquired over the years, yourself being at the front line of human rights defense, being at the front line, and you've been personally affected. I remember the story you told me about your wife, doctor, who was one of those people arrested, one of the 43 health workers, and you joined that campaign, not just to release your wife, but other prisoners as well, and that you've been involved in several activities, really campaigning for the respect of human rights in the Philippines. And Jigs Clamor is the Deputy Secretary General of KARAPATAN, and being Deputy Secretary General, he's also involved as a chief spokesperson or the Alliance's spokesperson to bring out the messages that KARAPATAN brings to us. And so I will introduce the other speakers as they come, but for now, I will hand over the floor to Jigs. Welcome, my friend. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Japhet. On behalf of Karapatan, I wish to convey our deepest gratitude and appreciation to ICHRP Canada for taking the initiative to launch a campaign for political prisoners in the Philippines. Allow me first to briefly introduce Karapatan. Karapatan is an alliance of individuals, groups, and organizations working for the promotion and protection of human rights in the Philippines. Its founders and members have been at the forefront of the human rights struggle in the Philippines since the time of Marcos regime. In June this year, there are several relevant developments concerning the human rights situation under the Duterte administration. First, President Duterte approved and signed into law the new Anti-Terrorism Act of 2020. Duterte has totally disregarded the clamor of various people's organizations, human rights institutions, including the United Nations, individuals who have expressed their opposition to the said law. As a result, at least 30 different groups have already filed their petition before the Philippine Supreme Court to overturn it. According to the National Union of People's Lawyers, the law is bad because of several arguments. I will just cite two of these. The law is bad because of criticizing the government may be wrongly considered as, quote, inciting to terrorism, unquote, and land you in jail in a rally, protest, or strike may be alleged to, quote, create a serious risk to public safety and falsely treated as terrorism. According to High Commissioner Chief for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, the recent passage of the new Anti-Terrorism Act heightens our concern about the blurring of important distinctions between criticism, criminality, and terrorism. With or without the new Anti-Terrorism Act, the human rights situation has become worse. Human rights violations continue to wreak havoc in the Philippines during this period of pandemic. Extrajudicial killings with impunity continue. Peace consultants who are supposedly protected under the Government of the Republic of the Philippines and the National Democratic Front of the Philippines joint agreement on safety and immunity guarantees were not spared. On March 13, 2020, NDFP Peace Consultant Julius Hiron and his companions Dr. Maria Lourdes de Mero Tanco and RB Alarco Reyes were killed by combined elements of Northern Luzon Command and Philippine National Police. They were sleeping and unarmed when they were gunned down. NDFP Peace Consultant Peace Randall Echanis, who is supposedly protected also under JASIG, was not spared. On August 10, Echanis was stabbed multiple times in an apartment he rented in Quezon City. Forensic pathologist Dr. Raquel Fortun, who autopsied Echanis, said in her initial findings, he was not killed instantly. Human rights defenders continue to become targets of political persecution under this Duterte administration. In April this year, former BAYAN Muna Iloilo City Coordinator Jose Reynaldo fondly called Jury Porquia, was also killed in his coffee shop in Iloilo City by 4 masked men suspected to be state agents. And just very recently, a colleague of us, Sara Alvarez, known human rights activist in Negros, was gunned down. In Negros, several known human rights defenders were killed. Last year, Karapatan's Negros officer and NUPL lawyer, attorney Benjamin Ramos, was also killed. Bernardino Patigas was also assassinated in Escalante City. Negros is one of the provinces where Memorandum Order Number 32 was issued in November 2018. Memorandum Number 32 is a directive which deployed more troops in the regions to, quote, suppress lawless violence and acts of terror. But we in Karapatan particularly noted the findings of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on the implementation of Memorandum Order Number 32, which has increased militarization and with far-reaching impact on the rights of the farmers and indigenous peoples. In particular, Michelle Bachelet, in her report, recommended the rescinding of Memorandum Order 32. Elena Tijamo, Program Coordinator of the Farmers Development Center, or FARDEC, was taken from her home at Barangay Campigganon, Bantayan, Cebu, last June 13 by 4 unidentified armed men accompanied by 2 women suspected to be military agents. According to initial reports, the unidentified men and women who took Tijamo did not introduce themselves and wore masks and black clothes. Tijamo remains missing. Just a few days from now, we will be commemorating again the International Day in support of the victims of enforced disappearance. But quickly, let us examine what common trends are evident. First, they were red tagged. Their photos were posted in a public place, maligning them as members of the CPP-NPA, for example, in the case of Atty. Ben Ramos, Bernardino Patigas, and very recently, Sara Alvarez. Second, they have experienced harassments and vilifications prior to their killings. And third, who have the means to conduct such operations in this period of lockdown or quarantine measures? Isn't it the state agents or those acting on behalf of the state security forces? Now, to understand why the killings continue, first, President Duterte also acts as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He has not done any concrete steps to put an end to those aspects of counterinsurgency operations which have led to targeting and execution of many individuals working with civil society organizations. Instead of pursuing peace talks to address the roots of the armed conflict, in December 2018, he issued an Executive Order Number 70, which created the National Task Force to End Local Communist Armed Conflict that institutionalized a whole-of-nation approach. We in Karapatan found out that there is a 50% increase in the number of victims of extrajudicial killings in line with counterinsurgency after this executive order was issued. In May 2020, after terminating for the nth time the peace negotiation with NDFP, President Duterte goaded his security forces by offering reward system for every commander to be killed or captured. Second, the criminal justice system has failed to arrest, convict, and imprison those responsible for extrajudicial killings. This is partly due to a bias of priorities that has law enforcement officials focused on prosecuting human rights defenders and civil society leaders rather than their killers. Apart from those horrendous killings, arbitrary arrests did not stop during this pandemic period. This time, ordinary civilians who were simply voicing out their grievances against the Duterte government's response to COVID-19 suffered the military's response. Based on the latest data from the Philippine National Police released on July 14, 2020, 69,834 were arrested. To cite one incident, on May 1, at least 76 individuals, relief workers, a priest, a lawyer, human rights workers, and women human rights advocates, alternative media workers, and student leaders were arbitrarily arrested. Now, in this brief sharing of human rights situation in the Philippines, we enjoin ICHRP Canada to continue its resolve and initiative to closely monitor the human rights situation in the Philippines, persuade and encourage different solidarity groups and individuals to take part and re-echo the calls to stop the killings, stop the attacks against human rights defenders, to hold accountable the perpetrators of human rights violations, to address the roots of the armed conflict by pursuing a just and lasting peace. Thank you very much. Muli, marami pong salamat at pakinggan po natin ang iba pa naman nating speakers.
Salama po, Jigs. That was wonderful. Thank you very much for giving us that opening presentation and giving us a clear contextual situation as it affects the political prisoners in the Philippines. We'll now be moving on to invite our second speaker. And let me remind you, if you have questions, please do put them in the Q&A section and they will be answered appropriately. Please, if you do have questions, put them and they will be answered appropriately. If you've just joined us, this is a release the political prisoners campaign, which has been launched by the International Coalition for Human Rights for the Philippines, the Canadian chapter. And my name is Japhet Ndhlovu. I am a board member of ICHRP Canada and I work for the United Church of Canada. Welcome, welcome. And feel free to put your questions if you have any as our speakers are going on. Our next speaker is Fides Lim. Fides Lim herself, a former political prisoner, is a writer and she's also an editor. And she has been involved in a lot of activism. She's a founding member of the Human Rights Alliance KARAPATAN, but also the political party BAYAN. And together with her husband, Vince, they have been involved, who has been involved as a democratic peace consultant. They have been very active, very active. And so she's here to speak to us today as a voice of Kapatid. And she will say briefly about this wonderful Sisters and Brothers organization before she launches into her speech. So she's here to speak to us, and I'll now call upon Fides to take over the floor. Welcome, Fides.
Thanks, Japhet. On behalf of the families of political prisoners in Kapatid, I greet you all at this moment when night meets day there in Canada at 8:29 p.m. and here in Manila at 8:29 a.m. Please stay with me for about 17 minutes as I run down 4 pointers to unify our outlook and basis of unity. 1. Who are the political prisoners of the Philippines? 2. What are the conditions in jails now? 3. What are the legal obstacles that are breeding political prisoners in growing numbers? 4. What is Kapatid? And what are the common objectives that we can push forward in unison? So, first, who are the political prisoners who define our common basis of action? A political prisoner is generally defined as a person imprisoned because of their political beliefs and actions. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in 2012 specified the concrete criteria of what defines a political prisoner, which point to purely political motives, conditions, and proceedings as the basis for their questionable detention. Political prisoners in the Philippines did not start only during martial law. They date back to the Spanish colonial period when resistance was patriotic duty. It is interesting to note that the country's oldest prison colony, The San Ramon Prison and Penal Farm in Zamboanga City was originally established through a royal decree promulgated in 1869 for persons convicted of political crimes. To demean the justness of their cause, political prisoners have been historically disparaged as brigands and outlaws and sentenced for high political crimes like treason, as in the case of the country's foremost political prisoner, our national hero, Jose Rizal. This historical pattern of vilification continued into the 1950s during the Hook Rebellion, when noted writer Amado V. Hernandez was imprisoned for rebellion, complex with murder, arson, and robbery. Although the Supreme Court in 1956 ruled that rebellion cannot be complex with common crimes since they are absorbed into the single act of rebellion, the Hernandez doctrine has since been blatantly eroded as political prisoners are simply charged with trumped-up common crimes which are non-bailable, to criminalize them and to keep them in indefinite detention. Today, the political prisoners embody the historic failure of the state to address the socio-economic roots of armed conflict, earning the Philippines the dubious distinction of having the longest running insurgency in the world. As long as these roots are not addressed, the phenomenon of political prisoners will continue in the Philippines. Second, what are the prison conditions now? There are around 635 political prisoners as of early August 2020. About 60% were arrested under the Duterte government, despite the Philippine Constitution's expressed prohibition on political imprisonment under Article 3, Section 18.1 of the Bill of Rights, that no person shall be detained solely by reason of their political beliefs or aspirations. The general complexion of political prisoners has hardly changed from the martial law years. Youths and students, trade unionists, peasants, writers, teachers, activists, religious people, and key opposition figures. The number of political prisoners from indigenous groups are also growing. Many are accused of being leaders and members of the Communist Party of the Philippines and New People's Army. There are also many moral prisoners linked to various moral groups. There are 70 convicted political prisoners, some of whom have been languishing in prison for 20 to 35 years. There are 53 elderly political prisoners, age 60 and above, my husband included, who is Bicladlad. 95 are sick with serious ailments, making them medically vulnerable to the lethal COVID-19 contagion. At least 5 have already died in prison under Duterte. The latest fatality is 61-year-old Adelaida Macusang, a community organizer from Davao, falsely accused of common crimes, who died last May 4. The wretched conditions of Philippine prisons compound the miseries of political prisoners. They are trapped in 3 tiers of the prison system. First, the police lockups in prisons at the lowest level. Then, the Bureau of Jail Management and Penology, or BJMP jails for those under trial, who constitute 70% of the prison population. And third, there's the Bureau of Corrections prisons, such as the New Bilibid prisons in Muntinlupa, for those who have been convicted of sentences of 3 or more years. The Duterte government's pointless drug war since 2016 has increased by 40% the prison population to 215,000, resulting in a congestion rate of 537% and above, the second highest in the world. It is not uncommon that detainees take turns sleeping on the floor sideways, which happened to my husband Bicladlad at Camp Karina, Quezon City, where he was first brought after being arrested for planted firearms in November 2018. The 70 peso daily meal allowance, insufficient as it is pared down further by corruption to around just 39 pesos. And because conditions are so terrible in jail, around 5,200 prisoners die every year at the NBP, the National Penitentiary, while 300 to 800 die every year in BJMP jails. Today, despite the unrelenting pressure of Kapatid on prison authorities to fully and transparently disclose the extent of COVID-19 infections and deaths, and to undertake mass testing of prisoners, there is a total lockdown on information. Now, factor in the Supreme Court's own data of a 72% judicial error rate on death penalty cases. This refers to the wrongful convictions by courts, affecting especially prisoners belonging to the lowest socio-economic class, who include political prisoners. This means 7 in 10 on death row were wrongfully convicted. And this simply means that over half of the prison population should not even be in jail. The disproportionate number of poor prisoners point to the failure of a criminal justice system that is far from just because it is broken and that is not balanced but tilted against the poor and powerless. Now, third, what are the legal obstacles in our struggle to free political prisoners, which constitute the state arsenal of political repression? 1. Red tagging. Philippine jurisprudence defines this as the act of labeling, branding, naming, accusing individuals and or organizations of being left-leaning, subversives, communists, or terrorists, used as a strategy by state agents against those perceived to be threats or enemies of the state. As mentioned by Jigs, this is the proximate cause that is breeding political prisoners in growing number, because it has become state policy that has led not only to political arrests but outright extrajudicial killings or the plain murder of activists such as Randall Etchanis and Zara Alvarez in the last 2 weeks. 2. There's the weaponization of laws. How and what are these legal weapons used to crush activism in the Philippines? 1. Planting evidence such as firearms under Republic Act 10591 and explosives under Republic Act 9516. 2. Utilizing the Human Security Act, which has now been superseded by the new Anti-Terror Act, to go after activists and dissenters in order to proscribe them like the CPP-NPA. 3. Combining legislative measures with presidential directives like Executive Order 70 on its whole-of-nation approach to go after the CPP-NPA and Memorandum Order 32, which declared a state of lawlessness in Negros, Samar, and Bicol, and the latest counter-insurgency program o Plan Kapanatagan. 4. Resurrecting the Arroyo government-initiated Interagency Legal Action Group or IALAG into the IACLA or the Interagency Committee on Legal Action, which is buttressed at the local government level by the National Task Force to End the Local Armed Conflict or NTF-LCAC in its multiple appendages at the regional, provincial, city, municipal, and even barangay levels. Third is the subversion of the entire judicial and legal process. This involves 1. Filing non-bailable charges to keep activists in prolonged detention. 2. Ignoring the landmark Hernandez Doctrine, which I mentioned earlier, which absorbed common crimes into the main political offense of rebellion. 3. Filing trumped-up cases of common crimes. 4. Producing false witnesses. 5. going around search requirements such as through flying search warrants from a Quezon City court to Negros and abusing generic John Doe warrants. 6. Filing charges in distant venues and simulating service of subpoenas. And 7. Invoking the presumption of regularity when questioned by courts about rights violations. In addition, political prisoners are continually singled out for discriminatory, arbitrary, and unfair treatment. Couples are kept in prolonged detention, although during martial law, the wife could be released to allow her to attend to the needs of their family and her arrested husband. There are now 13 political prisoner couples. Political prisoners are also dumped in detention areas far away from their places of residence, which in effect curtail their right of family visitation. Although segregation of prisoners by group, regional, or religious affiliation has long been a standard practice for better self-administration, political prisoners are now being denied this protective mechanism. A recent case in point is the plan late last year of the militaries in government to institute the so-called whole-of-nation approach in jails that sought to obliterate the political prisoners section in Bikutan, where the NDF consultants are detained, by using court motions to transfer and disperse the political prisoners to local jails. Even some of us relatives were banned from visiting them for some days during Christmas time in retaliation for protesting this plan. Fourth, now what is Kapatid? Who are we? And what do we fight for that we seek to join hands with you, our Canadian brothers and sisters from across the seas? Kapatid dates back to around 1978 during the martial law years when it was organized to support families of political prisoners. Last June 2019, as Japhet had mentioned, after lying dormant from around 1995 due to internal struggles within the movement, we relaunched Kapatid. Today, these are the primary objectives of Kapatid, which means brother and sister in the Philippine language. 1. Work for the release of all political prisoners. 2. Protect the basic rights and welfare of political prisoners. 3. Build the broadest support for political prisoners in the Philippines and abroad through information and education, welfare and services, organization and campaign, and national and international solidarity. And 4, move for affirmative action and reforms in relation to laws, policies, measures, instrumentalities that transgress human rights and engender the historical phenomenon of political prisoners in the Philippines. In 1 year of activity, with the support of the KARAPATAN Network and the Makabayan Bloc in Congress, we have successfully pressed the lifting of the prison lockdown at the NBP and reinstatement of visitation rights in October last year at the NBP. We filed a complaint against strip and cavity searches with the Commission on Human Rights, resulting in less stringent measures on invasive search procedures in the NBP. And we were able to abort the dismantling of the political prisoners section at Bikutan. And last April 8, assisted by human rights lawyers, we filed an urgent petition at the Supreme Court for the humanitarian release of prisoners, particularly the elderly, the sick, and pregnant prisoners who are most vulnerable to COVID-19. We took a leaf from the Iran government's move to release prisoners en masse around the second week of March. So we called this at first the Iran solution, which has now been strengthened by the call of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights for humanitarian releases, especially of political prisoners. I would like to stress that our petition covers not only political prisoners, vulnerable to COVID-19, but all prisoners similarly situated, because no one deserves to die from a virus. But because we are neither an Enrile nor an Imelda Marcos, who as favored cronies under the Duterte government were immediately granted bail for the non-bailable high crime of plunder, Solicitor General Jose Calida vehemently opposed our petition in the Supreme Court with the obvious intent to block the release of political prisoners. Significantly, however, although the government earlier made announcements that no releases were to be made because prisons are 100% safe from COVID-19, our campaign has made headway in generating support and collecting significant gains to benefit other prisoners. We especially take cognizance of the Supreme Court, DOJ, the Department of Justice, and BJMP public announcements that over 20,000 prisoners have been released since COVID started through circulars allowing reduced bail or recognizance in order to decongest prisoners. Yet, I stress, there is not a shadow of a political prisoner in these announced releases, not even short-term concessions, such as the temporary release of new mother political prisoner Reyna May Nacino, one of the 22 Supreme Court petitioners who gave birth last July 1 and was recently separated from her newborn daughter. I just hope that the government is not laying the basis for mooting our Supreme Court petition, nor elevating Calida's opposition as a kind of closure, just as Calida brazenly kicked out the Supreme Court Chief Justice from her post and summarily closed down ABS-CBN. But as I have noted in other forums, it will take more than 100 Calidas to defeat us. We know this will be a long and arduous struggle as political repression escalates in our midst in the Philippines, almost at pace with the trajectory of COVID-19. Not a day passes that we relatives of political prisoners worry for them. Do you know that not one of us relatives has visited our loved ones in jail since around March 11 when the prison lockdown started? But we never get too tired to pray nor too sad to dream. On this note, on behalf of Kapatid, we take heart and derive much hope from today's launching of the Political Prisoners Release Campaign of ICHRP Canada. We look forward to working with you. Together, as we did during martial law, we shall overcome. For there is nothing more powerful than those who are unafraid. Maraming salamat po. Thank you.
Salamat po. Mabuhay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fides, for that presentation, really calling for that needed, humane, just, and compassionate decision to urgently free political prisoners, and particularly those that are elderly, sick, and vulnerable. And by giving to us those 4 very clear areas. Who are they? What are the conditions? What are the legal obstacles? And what is Kapatid, or who is Kapatid? Thank you. Thank you, Fides. Thank you very much. Salama po. Please, if you have questions, do put them in the Q&A session, as we will be turning to them in a short while. And thank you for joining us on this platform as we are launching the release of Philippine Political Prisoners Campaign by ICHRP Canada. Chris, you're welcome as chair of BAYAN Canada. And Chris will be giving us a view from an ex-political detainee who is now in Canada. Chris, Perry, over to you, my friend. Speak to us.
Magandang
Welcome.
araw, good evening, good morning, depending on which part of the globe you are zoomed in with us. I always start my sharing on political prisoners by recognizing the work that Filipinos and Canadians did during the martial law years through the organizations of Coalition Against Marcos Dictatorship and the Development and Peace. Members of the Canada Coalition Against Marcos Dictatorship visited my family when they traveled to the Philippines. I was a political prisoner under Marcos regime that I stayed in prison for 22 months, and spent my detention camp is inside a military intelligence camp. The regular visits of CAMD members in the Philippines provided moral and political support to my family. They did not only did that moral and political support, but they also provided regular financial support to my family. The Development and Peace program adopted me as a political prisoner. They published letters of my family at church bulletins and read them at the church services. Development and Peace encouraged students in Quebec to send letters and greeting cards to provide Christmas cheers and support to us. That is where I first learned my lesson in French. Joyeux Noël. They gave us so much cheer. Those hundreds of cards made it hard for the military to start deciphering what messages they are, although it only says Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. These groups send regular supplies of groceries, set up income generating projects for us. They did not only mobilize political support, but also provided regular support to our families. This range of support included housing support, educational scholarships for our children, childcare, transportation allowances, and our families, so that our families can regularly visit us and follow up our cases in court and into the offices of the President of the Philippines. Groups organize regular visits so that they can see our prison and understand our prison condition and the very reason why we are in prison. Some of them were able to see our jail cells, shared our food, saw what food budget can give us. Our food allowance at that time was 9 pesos a day. We were able to negotiate the management of our own food budget and cook for our own meals. The groups did not only support us this way, they also distributed and purchased products we made in prison, like greeting cards, pendants, t-shirts, for they know that the money generated provided support to our families and supplement our food budget in prison. Realizing that our imprisonment will be long and undetermined on how we will be able to secure our freedom, our families reach out to friends, classmates, church people, supporters, and formed political prisoners committees. In my case, it was called the Committee for the Release of Christopher Sorio and the Bago Bantay 5. Their work continued even after my release in prison. They helped us settle, look for jobs. Some of them offered asylum to some people and provide sanctuary in another country, realizing that outside the prison, our lives was in danger, despite of that release and freedom we secured in jails. In my case, I was denied an NBI clearance for my departure to Canada and was called to return to the Intelligence Armed Forces Services Office to secure my clearance. As the colonel was signing my letter of clearance, he said, "I will sign this, but remember this. if you say anything against this government, we will look for you and we will make sure we can kill you. Supporting the political prisoners took different forms and responsibilities, but it is to sustain work of the Freedom Political Prisoners Committees that we were able to explore injustices and violations committed by the Marcos regime. It is also our lifeline behind bars. Once again, let me say salamat po sa mga Canadians, salamat po sa Filipinos in Canada. Because of your work, I am now here working for justice and peace in the Philippines. And because of our work, we were able to show that we can sustain a campaign that helps secure the release of Morong 43. We can do this again in a more sustained manner until all political prisoners are released and all the pillars of injustice are dismantled in the Philippines. Maraming salamat po sa inyong lahat at magandang gabi at magandang araw.
Salamat po, Perry. Thank you very much. Thank you for all these wonderful, clear presentations, calling us to action, giving us food for reflection, but also the need that there should be action. I'll now hand over to my friend Andy to lead us in the section of Q&A. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Japhet, and thank you to our speakers so far. It's been very informative, and I'm glad that we were recording this so that we can go back later and get some of the very useful information that has been delivered for us. I have only 2 questions right now. I'm asking the audience, if you have any questions, feel free to either put them in the Facebook comments, if that's where you're watching, or into the Zoom chat. So the first question is asked by Christian, who is a member of the Canada-Philippines Solidarity Organization, newly formed. Christian asks, the National Police reported 69,000 arrests, and the Philippine courts admitted they wrongfully executed 72% of capital convicts. Why does the government end up releasing such damning numbers during an ongoing civil war? Wouldn't it be smarter for them to hide these abuses from the public? And I believe this is a question for Jigs and Fides.
Oh, thank you for that question. First, in the Philippines, the Philippine National Police has been and always describing the situation as if they're doing something. But in reality, it's actually, as you can call it, it's inutility on their part to share the data that they have. For example, they have arrested 69,834, but to think that without looking into the impacts of these arrests with regards to human rights. No? So we think the Philippine National Police as making this narrative as if they're doing something about this, but it's actually a condemnable action especially coming from the human rights organization. And to think also that, for example, they did say that they investigated more than 4,000 in case of the drug-related killings, but only one out of those thousands investigation have resulted to a conviction. So in their own presentation, they are actually presenting their incompetency. They're not practicing their own, what we call, especially in the civil society organization, people's organization, due diligence. So maybe I think Fides would like to add on that.
Yeah. Let's just put it this way, in a more succinct summary of the problem. There's a foot-in-mouth problem with our police military forces. We have the most militaristic measures being imposed, but this has not even done anything to flatten the curve. Every day, the COVID numbers are on the rise, and yet every day, the police go after so-called violators of lockdown or quarantine measures, but this has not at all reduced the numbers of COVID sickness and fatalities in the country. Well, that's it, foot in mouth.
Thank you for the answers. Yeah, it's kind of shocking to see the how little they care. They're just willing to put that information out there because they feel like they can. So I have a question for, I believe Fides will be the first to answer this one, and there's a second part to the question. What are the most pressing needs of the political prisoners today?
Yeah.
What are the ones of support?
Yeah. There actually, we could say there are two areas of work that need to be done. First is in the area of political pressure. Second is in terms of material support. For the first dimension of political pressure, this actually is a big issue for me personally. Why? Because unlike Marcos, who showed some sensitivity during his time to international pressure, like he would back off, or let's say he would adjust certain policies in reaction to United Nations or international pressure regarding the issue of political prisoners. We have a president who speaks with all malice, and yet that malice becomes state policy. For instance, where do you have a president who talks shit about shooting NPA women? He calls them that way, shooting them in the vagina. And now we have activists who are dropping dead, who are being killed left and right, and yet government is silent on this, and they tell us to await the police investigation when it was the police themselves who took off with the corpse of Randall Echeniz and imprisoned an Anakpawis paralegal who was just trying to do his job to protect the body of Randall Echeniz. So, but I feel, the Philippine government, it's not run solely by the tongue of President Duterte. There are men and women around him who may be susceptible to political pressure. And I also feel that as shown during our particular pressure campaigns, for instance, I told you about this campaign when the militaries in government tried to dismantle the entire political prisoners wing in Camp Bikutan. We were able to abort, I hope, for good. Although, of course, we can never be sure, about their continuing plans to get back at political activists and critics, So I think political pressure can still work. Why? We have a Secretary of Justice, Bernardo Guevara, who has shown instances of listening or being sensitive to the appeals to criticism. We also have other cabinet members. We have people at the House of Representatives, and we have senators who likewise show some sensitivity, especially those who are already siding with the people on many issues. Now, on material support, constantly, we have to bear the pressures of financial assistance for political prisoners, like for their legal defense fund, because of course, nothing comes free. people need, lawyers need, and families need support to be able to visit, to be able to handle cases. So we welcome very much financial assistance and likewise material support. For instance, we have already received 2 big boxes of support from the Philippine-German Solidarity Group. They have sent clothes, books, writing instruments, anything which they feel can be of help. So at least, and then come December, and I really hope that by then that COVID has already receded, we will be again requiring travel funds to enable families of political prisoners to visit them, because many families live in far-flung areas, like for instance in Bicutan, many come from the southern Luzon provinces, from Bicol. There are also those from southern Tagalog, and they will need travel money to be able to visit their relatives. That's it.
Thank you, Fides, for outlining those 2 very important forms of support that are needed. I have one final question in the interest of time. It's a question from Byrne, who is a member of ICHRP. And the question is, what has been the Duterte government's response to UN resolutions and experts' statements? And I'll direct this to Jigs. I'll repeat the question. What has been the Duterte government's response to the UN resolutions and experts' statements? I'll direct it to Jigs and then ask Fides if there are any additional points.
Just like what we have expected, the Philippine government is again in a state of denial, denying the allegations presented by the High Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, on the spate of killings and other forms of human rights violations. So they kept on denying and saying that the report is actually the report of the High Commissioner, alleging it as coming from unsubstantiated facts. Well, in fact, we actually responded to that before the High Commissioner came up with such report. The Office of the High Commissioner has actually did number of research, interviews, reports coming from different civil society organizations from all different sectors. So to allege that the report of the High Commissioner is unsubstantiated is actually unfounded, and we think it's just a way of the Philippine government on its narrative that they are not violating the human rights of the Filipinos.
I echo Jig's statement, but I would just like to add this. I think it's high time, for international solidarity groups, to press their own governments to bear down on the Philippine government, particularly, for instance, economically, financially, through trade, through trade, investments, or whatever, because as I have mentioned earlier, some sectors, some cabinet sections, have shown sensitivity despite the insensitivity of the highest position of the land, who is the president himself. I think it should now be not just political pressure, but other forms of pressure like trade sanctions, economic, etc.
Thank you very much for answering those questions and giving more wealth to the conversation that we've been having here. And clearly the call for the continued advocacy to campaign for the release of the Philippine political prisoners. It is a just thing to do. It is a compassionate thing to do. It is a humane thing to do. Release them, release them, release them. Thank you. We'll now have solidarity messages, and we will invite the Negros Youth Group to start to bring to us the solidarity message. Do we have somebody? Is it Zoe doing it? Who is bringing the message from the Negros Youth Group?
Hi.
Go ahead, Zoe.
Before I start, I'll introduce myself and our group. So I am Zoe from the National Network of Agrarian Reform Advocates Youth, and we have a chapter in Negros wherein one of our members has been detained. So the National Network of Agrarian Reform Advocates Youth is a youth and students organization in the Philippines advocating for genuine agrarian reform. And today I'll be discussing Karina case and a few issues linked to her arrest. So the Memorandum Order Number 32, or MO32, was signed by President Rodrigo Roa Duterte on November 22, 2018, which declared a state of lawless violence in the regions of Samar, Bicol, and Negros. And according to our government, the Memorandum Order Number 32 will help address this lawless violence in the regions. The declaration has seen an unwelcomed entry of the scores of police, military, and even paramilitary battalions. And as we saw it, they weren't there to actually stop lawless violence, but to suppress any peasant activity that struggles for genuine agrarian reform. The MO32 have led to the intensified military operations within civilian communities in the Bicol region, aerial bombings among communities in Samar, and peasant massacres in Negros. Through MO32, peasants and peasant advocates who organized to demand free land distribution by dismantling the oppressive haciendas and plantations are red tagged, terror tagged, and then targeted. But the MO32 is just part of the Executive Order Number 70, instituting the state's whole of nation approach to crushing the communist insurgency, which militarizes the civilian government bureaucracy to mobilize it against any dissent. It saw the creation of the National Task Force to End Local and Communist Armed Conflict, or the NTF-LCAC, which has been a terror tagging and red tagging spree since its inception, and it have continually targeted unarmed civilians. The task force remains operational and receives a hefty budget even amidst the COVID-19 pandemic, when the people need socio-economic aids the most, and not a fascist suppression of basic and fundamental rights. Under the MO32 and the EO70, a de facto martial law has been implemented in Bicol, Samar, Negros regions, as well as the whole of the Philippine archipelago. Since the policy's inception, the Filipino people has witnessed illegal arrests, filing of trumped-up charges, attacks on all forms and platforms, and even extrajudicial killings. One thing is for sure, MO32 and the EO70 legitimize state fascism, state terrorism. And now they added the anti-terror law to these policies in order to further stifle dissent. We've seen the effects of these policies several times. In fact, during this pandemic, two of our colleagues, Karandi and Zara, were brutally killed. And it is worth noting that Karandi and Zara were among the individuals terror tagged by the state, and were amongst those who were initially included at the Department of Justice terror prescription list. These policies have also led to illegal arrests and the filing of trumped-up charges among activists, peasant advocates, peasants, and human rights defenders. And an example of which would be what happened during the simultaneous raids in Bacolod. On October 31 of last year, at around 5 p.m., 55 individuals, including minors, were rounded up by the Crime Investigation and Detection Group, Bacolod City Police Station, and the 3rd Infantry Battalion of the Philippine Army during the simultaneous raids of the offices of progressive organizations such as Gabriela, Bayan Muna, Kilusang Mayo Uno, and the National Federation of Sugar Workers in Bacolod City and Negros Occidental. The following day, November 1, the office of the National Federation of Sugar Workers in Escalante City was also raided and 2 individuals were arrested. Among those arrested in the simultaneous raids was Karina de la Serna, then a 19-year-old student and peasant advocate, who was charged of illegal possession of explosives. And just a few months ago, they charged her again with a case of human trafficking. It is important to highlight that these raids and arrests that led to the arrest of Karina were carried out by using defective search warrants, which were issued by a Quezon City RDC executive judge. The joint operations were authorized by the Region 6 Task Force to end local communist armed conflict in compliance with the Malacanang's Memorandum Order No. 32, Uplan Kapanatagan, and Executive Order No. 70. The police and the military alleged that those arrested were conducting combat and indoctrination training, as firearms and explosives were allegedly found in the raided offices. But despite these preposterous claims, there are actual video footages uploaded in social media showing how the CIDG operatives planted the firearms and explosive in the said offices. The actual facts are the raiding teams have used defective search warrants and have planted evidences. Raids and the planting of firearms and explosives to justify arrest are old tricks in the government's playbook of political repression. Those apprehended in the Negros raids and arrests are members of democratic and progressive mass organizations. They are all unarmed civilians, several of which are minors. And the ultimate objective of these human rights violations is to quell the growing dissent in Negros and to send a chilling effect among those individuals who are fighting and criticizing the Duterte regime. But the Filipino people will not resist. We will fight back. And as we've seen, the youth have continually stood up with the toiling masses in putting an end to this fascist state, putting an end to this massive oppression and exploitation done by the Duterte regime. In fact, we have launched a Free Karina Hands-Off Peasant Advocates campaign last year, December 6, as a timely response to the series of attacks happening all over the country, especially the raids last October 30, 2019 in Negros by the Philippine National Police, Armed Forces of the Philippines, and the Criminal Investigation and Detection Group, which targeted activists and progressives. Karina de la Serna is a young Negrense peasant advocate and the Deputy Secretary General of NNARA-Youth. She is at the forefront of the youth peasant advocacy in Negros, initiating campaigns, activities, forums, and performances in order to raise awareness on the national plight carried by the Filipino peasantry. She is one of those arrested among the farmers and activists illegally arrested during the October raids, and one of the 11 still illegally detained today. She was with fellow peasant advocates in the middle of rehearsals for a performance for Negros Day when she was taken by the authorities. The police and the military earlier claimed to have recovered 32 assorted firearms, grenades, bladed weapons, and several ammunitions from the raided offices. This was what they used in order to justify the trumped-up charges they filed against Karina and several others. Karina de la Serna, now 20 years old, continued to be detained at the Negros Occidental District Jail in Bago City, and about a year in jail, and yet she is still waiting for a court hearing and a chance to defend herself and gain back her liberty. As she continued to be detained, Karina continues to face the threat of another trumped-up charge to be filed against her. The struggle for genuine agrarian reform that Karina joined is a very important campaign, especially in the Philippines, where more than half of the population is made up of farmers. And this social political climate, their sector is the most vulnerable to changes as being the forefront of agriculture and national food production. Farmers face the heaviest burden in terms of landlessness and threats to job security. They lack institutional support, and now conditions are even more so worsening under the Duterte regime, where they are being made easy targets of the state's aggression against alleged communist-led insurgency in the countryside. Duterte has also allowed farmers to be direct political and economic victims of the rice liberalization law in 2019. The government have assisted private land development and land grabbing nationwide, and his ongoing spree of attacks against the Filipinos' democratic human rights. These series of attacks in which the raids is part of is hardly new. It's been endured since his assumption into office. This is part of his commitment to silencing the nationalist individuals and groups by means of state-sponsored violence. As of July 10, 2020, 262 farmers and peasant workers have been killed under this administration. The Free Karina Hands of Peasant Advocates campaign is ultimately a response to Duterte's reign of terror and on the administration's grave attacks on peasant advocacy, as well as an urgent call to release Karina and all peasant advocates who are political prisoners. The campaign's objectives are to establish and strengthen the call for the immediate release and the repeal of trumped-up charges against Karina de la Serna and all other political prisoners, to consolidate material and moral support for Karina de la Serna and all those detained political prisoners, and to engage the public to support the plight of the farmers. It is also there to expose and oppose the attacks and the defamation against the peasant movement and its advocacies. We continually call everyone's support in our campaigns and calling for the release of all political prisoners and to free Karina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe. There is another piece of important information, and we may need to pick it up at another opportune time, particularly for the release of Karina. Thank you, Zoe. I'll hand over to my colleague Benjamin to speak to us now about the ICHRP's campaign for freeing political prisoners. Benjamin, over to you.
Thank you, Japhet. Thank you everyone here, and thank you to Jigs and Fides and Perry for sharing their work and their experiences with us. Thank you, Zoe, for telling us about Negros and the whole situation faced by activists in the Philippines, especially peasant activists. Thank you everyone in Canada and the Philippines and elsewhere for joining us in support of this campaign to free all political prisoners. Thanks also to Charlotte, who will be speaking after me. So my name is Benjamin. I'm a member of Canada-Philippines Solidarity Organization in Toronto. We're a member organization of ICHRP Canada, and we've been supporting this campaign. So tonight, I'm here to tell you a bit about our plans for the campaign. Part of our work is to make connections with organizations like Kapatid and KARAPATAN, who know the prisoners and their needs and who can provide us with information on the prisoners, their families, and local campaigns for their release. We're also making connections with organizations like Samidoun and others who support political prisoners from progressive struggles around the world. So the campaign is structured around building political support, educational support, and material support for political prisoners. Most prisoners have been targeted for activities in a particular sector, such as worker or peasant activism, reporting on human rights abuses, mobilizing youth and students, or consulting on the peace process. So to build political support for particular prisoners, we've begun organizing prisoners by sector, and the plan is to approach Canadian organizations and ask them to adopt prisoners in similar sectors. Hopefully this way we can match up organizations with prisoners. It will build a connection with the members of those organizations through their shared sectoral work. And in terms of political support, we're asking organizations to pass resolutions supporting our campaign and to write letters to the Philippine government and to the Canadian government to call for the release of their adopted prisoner. So we've made a small start on a campaign around this young woman who was mentioned, Reina May Nacino, who was arrested on trumped-up charges in Tondo in Manila. So she gave birth to her daughter on July 1st. My understanding is her new baby is with Reina May's mother, and the mother and daughter are separated. So we've been approaching youth, student, and women's organizations to ask them to write letters calling for her release to government officials in the Philippines. We are also asking them to write to the Canadian ambassador in Manila to call for him to follow Canadian government guidelines on human rights defenders. So this is part of a toolbox put out by the Canadian government, and it says that Canadian officials can visit detainees to ensure their good treatment and to call for their release by the host state. So we're trying to put pressure both on the government at home and on the Philippine government as well. We're also building educational support. So by providing resources on political repression in the Philippines, publicizing the basis for the political struggles that are ongoing, like the need for genuine land reform. And so we can explain to people why activists are becoming political prisoners and why they should be released. We also are asking organizations who support the campaign to share this educational resources with their membership. We'll also be holding some days of action throughout the year to respond to current events, commemorate older events, and build public awareness of our organizations and of the campaign itself. And lastly, we're also working with other organizations to provide material support to prisoners and their families. So a number of the former speakers have talked about material support. At the moment, we're just beginning to build the support. Right now, we are directing people to the United Church of Canada, which has a pre-existing legal fund for political prisoners in the Philippines. And we will be sending a donation link to everyone who's registered, but that's just first steps. And like a lot of the other speakers, I want to emphasize the trumped up nature of the charges faced by political prisoners. A lot of them, and we've been building a database of these prisoners, and it's very obvious a lot of them are charged with possession of illegal firearms or explosives, really easily fabricated charges, and it's because these charges aren't bailable. All it needs is for a police officer to drop a .45 in someone's desk and say, look, we found a gun. And a lot of the warrants that are being using are signed by pet judges of the military or the police, like Quezon City RTC Executive Judge Cecilyn Burgos Villaverde. She's the judge who signed the warrants for the Bacolod raids, as well as many, many other warrants against activists. And a lot of the prisoners are also consultants to the peace process, and they're supposed to be protected by the Joint Agreement on Safety and Immunity Guarantees, or JASIG. So the government is also violating part of the peace process. And like a number of the other speakers, I want to, remind us all that while we're working to free political prisoners, former prisoners and activists like Randy Achanes and Zara Alvarez are still being killed for their activism in support of the struggle against these semi-feudal and semi-colonial conditions in the Philippines. Just on Sunday, Bay Milda Ansaro, a Manobo Lumad land defender, was killed. So this campaign is just a small part of the broad effort to keep this option of a legal democratic struggle for a just and lasting peace in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benjamin, for giving us what ICHRP Canada is doing. Over to Samidoun. Charlotte, welcome.
Hello, thank you very much for inviting me to join you today and for inviting us and Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network to be a part of the campaign that you are organizing to free all political prisoners in the Philippines. Much like you are organizing to free all political prisoners in the Philippines, our campaign and our network organizes to free all Palestinian political prisoners. We recognize that political prisoners in the Philippines and political prisoners in Palestine confront many of the same enemies, are together confronting imperialism, are together confronting colonialism and neocolonialism, are together confronting the same US war machine that with its alliance partner Israel in occupied Palestine is conducting daily war crimes and crimes against humanity. And in the Philippines, just as we see Duterte ramping up the level of repression and political imprisonment and incarceration against the popular and mass democratic movements in the Philippines, we see that Duterte and the Israeli regime are building their bonds tighter and tighter together, politically, militarily, and economically as well. And so the necessity of joint struggle between our movements becomes more and more relevant, even though that necessity is building on a very long history of shared struggle and commitment from Palestinian organizers, from organizers in the Philippines, to struggle for justice and liberation from imperialism and colonialism everywhere in the world, and to stop the US war machine from Palestine to the Philippines. And so what we see in both Palestine and the Philippines is the use of the false terrorist label to imprison and to justify the imprisonment of activists, of organizers, of community leaders. We see that these political prisoners are those who are worker organizers, peasant organizers, women's union leaders, student activists and organizers. Much as we see student organizers in the Philippines in prison, in Palestine every year, especially when campus elections are starting to approach, what we see are Israeli occupation forces invading Palestinian universities, tearing apart student organization offices, and throwing student leaders in prison. Currently, there are over 300 university students, Palestinian university students inside Israeli occupation prisons. This is among nearly 5,000 Palestinian political prisoners, as well as over 400 Palestinians who are jailed without charge or trial under so-called administrative detention. And we know that just like in the Philippines, this kind of impunity could not continue if not for the official support that these regimes receive from the United States, as well as in many cases from the Canadian government as well. And so it becomes particularly important for us to organize and mobilize around the world to build solidarity and to free political prisoners from Palestine to the Philippines, recognizing that this is an internationalist struggle and that around the world we are confronting common enemies and we are viewing a common future of justice and liberation, that any movement that leaves behind its political prisoners is destined to face, is leaving behind those who present true leadership in the most difficult, repressive, and torturous of conditions, and who continue to provide a guiding star for movements, activists, and organizers everywhere. And this is true from Palestine to the Philippines. We know that in the Philippines, political prisoners have repeatedly shown solidarity to Palestinian political prisoners on hunger strike, engaged in struggle, recognizing that common bond of internationalism and that common struggle for justice and liberation. In 2017, Filipino political prisoners in Camp Bagang Diwa wrote a letter to Palestinian prisoners on hunger strike saying, "Your struggle is very similar to ours. Like you, we are victims of the worst conditions in jails and the slow pace of justice in the Philippines. We are also victims of injustice. We were illegally arrested because of our political beliefs. We are charged with trumped up cases, jailed, or wrongly convicted to keep us behind bars for many years. Zionist Israel, which is the primary instrument of US imperialism against the Palestinian people, has victimized thousands and millions of your peoples. It has caused the denial of homes and lands to the people of Palestine, using state terror and brutal wars to impose its hegemony over the political, economic, and social aspects of your life as a people. But your continuing struggle is an inspiration to all oppressed and struggling peoples of the world, including the Filipino people who are fighting for national liberation and genuine democracy." And inside Palestine, many activists and prisoners have responded to this call with, and have responded to this solidarity with strong solidarity with the movement in the Philippines. Joining this movement, I am not just representing Samidoun Palestinian Prisoner Solidarity Network, but also the sentiment of the Palestinian Progressive Movement and the sentiment of the Palestinian political prisoners, which stands with the struggle of people in the Philippines to free all political prisoners and to obtain true justice, democracy, and liberation. I just want to close by reading a statement that was written by our comrades inside Occupied Palestine, the Samidoun chapter in Occupied Palestine, in support of the call to free all Philippine political prisoners. We express our full support and solidarity to our comrades and friends in the Philippines and join with all movements and forces urging the immediate release of all political prisoners and detainees. Especially amid the global pandemic of COVID-19, the situation of these prisoners in the jails and detention camps run by the current US-backed fascist government presents a serious threat to their lives. According to KARAPATAN, the Philippine Foundation for the Rights of Political Prisoners, there are 532 political prisoners in the Philippines. Of these, 209 were arrested during the Rodrigo Duterte government. The liberation movement, and they include many elders, women, sick prisoners, 5 children, and consultants for the National Democratic Front of the Philippines in the peace negotiations. The liberation movement in the Philippines has fought a bitter struggle for half a century against various fascist, dictatorial, corrupt, or exploitative regimes that have successively governed the country, all supported by the United States. The Philippines was subjected to American occupation and colonialism from 1898 until 1946, and the Revolutionary and People's Movement is fighting for control of for people's control of the resources and land, and to implement meaningful agricultural reform, social rights, and equality. It is worth noting here that the Communist Party of the Philippines has always adopted a clear stand on the struggle of the Palestinian people and their national rights, and has shown its solidarity on more than one occasion with the Palestinian prisoners movement and with the freedom fighter George Abdullah. In addition, the legal national democratic movement and the social movements of the Philippines have also shown their solidarity with Palestine, the Palestinian people, and their prisoners, including church groups, labor organizations, women organizations, and youth movements. Samidoun Network and Occupied Palestine joins the call of these movements for the release of political prisoners in the Philippines and expresses our strongest solidarity with the people's movement for justice and liberation. And so we look forward to continuing to work together to build on that global solidarity here in Canada and around the world, and to free all political prisoners from Palestine to the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte, for bringing us that message and giving us that parallel from Palestine to the Philippines. Where do we go from here? What happens now? Doug will come up now with the next steps. Over to you, Doug. You are muted, Doug.
Anything. Okay, there. Before I get to next steps, I just wanted to follow up on a couple of points that people had made, Ben in particular, and stuff about how the Philippine government really doesn't care. And one of the things that struck me, I've had the privilege of going into the Philippine prisons 4 or 5 or 6 times in different parts, but primarily in Batangas. And I noticed on the list that we've been sent of political detainees, some of the people who I visited 4 years ago are still there. One of them is named Albert Custodio. And I asked him, how did your last hearing go? And he kind of laughed and said, well, they screwed up. And I was like, what do you mean? And he said, well, the gun that they alleged that I had, the serial numbers that they had written down didn't match the gun that they produced in court. So essentially they fabricated the evidence, and then they messed up what they were trying to purporting that he had. So then, well, that didn't mean that the case got dismissed. It just meant that they got another chance to go look for the gun that they had supposedly planted on him in the first place. So there's a bit of Keystone Cops in some of this. They don't care because these people don't get out of prison unless there's significant pressure, unless there is mass campaigns. We have successfully got people out of prison. I remember some of the people over the years in Batangas were released. Some of their names aren't familiar to me anymore, but there is a possibility of getting people out through hard work. So that brings us to next steps. We've gotten this far in Canada with about 8 dedicated activists working off the side of their desk. We do this in our spare time. And we're at the point now where we're close to having a website launch, which will spit out letters to various people. We'll have profiles on the various political detainees. Given our size, we're going to start small. We've identified 6 individuals that we're working on for the kind of initial phase of the campaign. That includes Bob Reyes, who is a a member of Courage, which is essentially the Philippine equivalent of NUPG or QP, Public Sector Union. He was arrested in 2018 and convicted in 2019. Oh, no, sorry, that's somebody else. He was arrested in 2018, faces a number of charges, of course, the usual possession of firearms and explosives and arson in a place that he's never been to in a far-flung area of Mindanao. Another labor adoptee is Majo of the KMU, Majo Maga. The KMU is sort of the equivalent of the CLC in Canada. He is one of the quickest convicted political detainees that I've ever seen. He was arrested in February of 2018 and convicted in June of 2019, just over a year. Normally these cases drag through the courts for years and years and years. So obviously the state had it in for him. He was convicted of firearms possessions, I believe. In the church sector, which is another focus of the campaign, we're looking at supporting Ray Casambre and Vic Ladlad. Both of them are peace activists, peace consultants. Casambre was coordinator of the Philippine Peace Center, which is a partner of EcuVoice, part of EcuVoice. And then we're looking at two youth activists, Karina de la Serna, whose case was discussed extensively. She's the Negros youth activist who was arrested at 19 years of age last October 31st in the mass crackdown. And Reina May Nacino, who also was mentioned a number of times tonight, she gave birth on July 1st. So she has an Independence Day baby, I guess. Or is that July 4th? Anyway, so those are our that's the focus of our campaign for the next few weeks. Essentially, what we'd like to do with many of the participants and attendees is have them join us. We need to start to establish committees in not just having a national committee of us, but to have committees in Vancouver, in Toronto, in Edmonton that can help popularize the campaign and help us do outreach work to public sector unions, to the churches, and to other things. We need to focus on the two main pillars of the campaign, and that is the political support for the political prisoners, and the financial and economic support to. I know from being in the prison that prisoners can't survive on the food that is provided by the Bureau of Jail Management. They're dependent on outside help to sustain themselves. So we need to develop a fundraising strategy around that to build support also for the needs of the prisoners and their families, and that will be part of the upcoming launch as well. So in the next couple of weeks, we'll be reaching out to you, and we hope that you will reach out to us to help support the campaign as we go forward. And that's I want to thank everybody who participated in our launch, and thank everybody who dialed in. Most of the night we had over 75 participants. I think that exceeded our expectations, and we'll continue to do the legwork to build support for this campaign, to build support for our government. We've been very successful in our lobbying efforts to this point. and we'll continue to do this work in support of people at risk in the Philippines. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and thank you all for coming. We had people following on Facebook and on Zoom, and with a total of about 139 participants today. Thank you very much to our speakers. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And international solidarity continues. And with this campaign, we continue to call for the release of all political prisoners. We are with you. You are not alone in this struggle. We are together for the sake of justice, for the sake of human dignity, for the sake of all God's people. Thank you, dear friends, and goodbye, good morning, good evening, good night. Thank you. It was good to be with you. Bye for now.
Hi, everybody.